Welcome to the deep dive. You know the story of the Titanic? It's just one of those that sticks with you, doesn't it? Over a century later.
Absolutely. It's this mix of human drama, maybe a bit of hubris, and just the raw power of nature.
Totally. But today, we're going to try and strip away some of that drama, maybe the romance even, and really focus on the science, the engineering, the physics, the material science, what actually caused this supposedly unsinkable ship to go down.
Yeah, it's really the ultimate case study, isn't it? We're drawing mainly from an educational guide, Titanic Science, which gets into the physics and chemistry, but also pulling in details from the official 1912 U.S. Senate report. Incredibly detailed stuff.
Right. So our mission really is to get inside this thing. It was the peak of technology for its time.
Yeah.
How did this marvel of engineering meet its end through a combination of, well, ancient ice and maybe some flawed Edwardian tech?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start with just the sheer scale. When Titanic sailed in April 1912, it wasn't just a big ship. It and its sister, Olympic, were literally the largest moving objects ever built by humans up to that point.
It's hard to even picture now. The scale sort of embodies the ambition, maybe the overconfidence of that whole era.
Give us the numbers again.
Okay, so length, 882.5 feet. That's nearly 3 American football fields end to end.
Wow.
With 93 feet. And height, from the very bottom, the keel, up to the top of those iconic funnels, 175 feet. Its draft, how deep it sat in the water, was about 34.5 feet.
And everything on it had to be just as massive, right?
Exactly. The rudder needed to steer this thing. 78 feet high, weighed 101 tons.
100 tons for the rudder.
Yeah. And the anchors, the 3 main ones combined, weighed 31 tons. It was just peak industrial power on display.
And moving this beast, that took some serious power generation.
Well,
It wasn't
yeah.
just simple steam engines, was it?
No, it was actually quite innovative for the time, a kind of hybrid system. You had 2 enormous 4-cylinder reciprocating steam engines, the traditional type.
Okay.
But then it also had a third engine, a low-pressure turbine, which used the exhaust steam from the first 2. More efficient. Altogether, they generated something like 46,000 horsepower.
And feeding that power, that meant coal. Lots of coal.
Oh, tons of it. You had 29 huge boilers and 159 furnaces being constantly stoked by hand. All that just to keep it cruising at around 22.5 knots, which is about 26 miles per hour.
Now, the way it was built is also pretty interesting, especially when we get to why it sank. The financing.
Right. The financial context is actually crucial for understanding potential issues later, particularly with materials. Harland and Wolff in Belfast built it on what's called a cost-plus contract.
Which means?
It means the White Star Line essentially agreed to pay Harland and Wolff the full cost of all materials and all the labor, plus a guaranteed percentage on top as profit.
So theoretically, there's no incentive to cut corners on materials or quality.
All right.
No expense spared.
Theoretically, yes. The final cost was about $7.5 million back in 1912. Today, that's, what, over $400 million? A staggering sum.
And the focus wasn't speed, unlike some rivals.
No, not primarily. Cunard Line had the faster ships, like Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star Line was going for size, stability, and above all, luxury, guaranteeing a smooth, week-long crossing in absolute style.
And that luxury aspect really defined it.
It really did. First class was basically like the best hotel you could imagine, just floating.
Yeah.
Huge suites, gyms, a swimming pool, which was pretty novel, squash courts, Turkish baths.
Even second class was supposedly better than first on many other ships.
That's what they say. But then you had the contrast, right? Our sources mention this stark divide, young aristocrats up top with silk and velvet.
Wow, down below.
Down in third class, or steerage, you had mostly immigrants, Irish, Scandinavians hoping for a new life. They were often 4 to a tiny cabin, basically a metal box. And there were actual gates, mandated by U.S. immigration rules at the time, physically separating them from the upper decks.
The logistics just to provision this floating city. Mind-boggling.
The lists are amazing. 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 40 tons of potatoes, 36,000 oranges, 20,000 bottles of beer and stout.
Okay, I get it. It was well-stocked. And cargo. Not treasure, right?
No, not really a treasure ship. The general cargo was valued around $420,000 in 1912, which was significant, but not astronomical compared to the ship's value.
All right, let's shift from the spectacle to the science. How does 66,000 tons of steel even float? Seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it comes down to 2 core physics principles, buoyancy and displacement.
Buoyancy is the upward push from the water.
Exactly. Any liquid exerts an upward force. Think about trying to push a beach ball underwater.
Right, it pushes back up.
That's buoyancy. Now, why does a lump of steel sink, but the Titanic, made of steel, float?
It's the shape, right, spreading the weight out.
Precisely. Like taking modeling clay. A ball sinks, but flatten it out, shape it into a bowl.
It floats because the upward force is acting over a much bigger area.
And crucially, because of the volume of water it's pushing aside, that's displacement, Archimedes' principle.
Okay, refresh my memory on Archimedes.
Simple version. An object placed in water sinks until the weight of the water it is pushed out of the way displaced is exactly equal to its own weight.
So Titanic weighed 66,000 tons.
Meaning it pushed aside exactly 66,000 tons of seawater to float. As long as the ship's weight is less than or equal to the weight of the water it can displace, it stays afloat. The entire safety design relied on maintaining that balance.
Which brings us neatly to the feature that was supposed to make it practically unsinkable, the bulkheads.
Yes, the watertight compartments.
Yeah.
The ship was divided internally by 15 transverse bulkheads, creating 16 separate compartments.
And these had watertight doors.
Yes, heavy doors that could be closed electrically from the bridge or automatically by floats if water entered, theoretically sealing off any breached section.
And the design was meant to handle some pretty serious damage.
It was, for the time. It was calculated that the Titanic could stay afloat even if any two of its middle compartments were completely flooded. Or, crucially, even if the first 4 forward compartments were breached and filled with water.
That sounds pretty robust. So what was the flaw?
The fatal flaw, the one that the ship's own designer, Thomas Andrews, recognized almost immediately after the collision, was how high those bulkheads actually went.
They didn't go all the way up.
No, they only extended vertically up to E-deck. Which sounds high, but on a ship that size, E-deck was still several feet below the main passenger decks, and critically, only about 10 feet above the waterline when the ship was loaded.
I see where this is going.
It's the Achilles heel. If more than 4 forward compartments started to flood, the bow would inevitably dip lower and lower into the water.
And once the water level inside those flooded compartments reached the top of the bulkhead?
It would just spill over into the next compartment, like water overtopping sections in an ice cube tray. One by one, sequentially flooding the entire ship from bow to stern.
So the watertight compartments weren't truly watertight above E-deck level.
Exactly. Andrews knew this. He did the grim calculation on board. With 6 compartments breached by the iceberg, the ship was doomed. The water would spill over the bulkheads. He estimated they had maybe 2 hours left.
And the actual time it took to sink was?
2 hours and 40 minutes. His calculation was tragically accurate. That design choice, possibly made to maximize the grand interior spaces on the decks above, was the built-in mechanism for total failure once the damage exceeded that 4-compartment threshold.
Okay, so the ship itself had this hidden vulnerability. Now let's talk about what it hit. Part 2, the collision science. That iceberg, it had its own ancient history.
It really did. Think about this. The snow that formed that iceberg fell on Greenland maybe 3,000 years ago.
Wow.
It got compressed over centuries into dense glacier ice, flowed incredibly slowly, maybe 65 feet a day towards the coast, and eventually broke off, calved, into the North Atlantic. And it was freshwater ice, important to note, denser than saltwater.
And hitting one that far south was unusual.
Extremely unusual. Greenland calves thousands of icebergs every year, maybe 15,000 to 30,000. But only a tiny fraction, maybe 1%, drift far enough south, below 48 degrees north latitude, to actually cross the main shipping lanes.
So maybe 150 to 300 a year make it that far.
Right. But 1912, that year was different. It was an exceptionally bad year for ice. Records show 395 icebergs sighted south of that line in April 1912 alone.
That's more than the typical annual total just in 1 month.
Exactly. It was the highest number recorded until 1970. Captain Smith, the commander, was experienced, but he likely didn't grasp just how dense the ice field he was steaming towards actually was that night.
And he kept the speed up.
He did, following common practice, trusting the lookouts, assuming the vastness of the ocean gave enough time to maneuver. An assumption based on perhaps less ice in previous years or just standard operating procedure.
And the physics of the iceberg itself.
Yeah.
The hidden part.
That's the terrifying part. We all know the saying tip of the iceberg, for good reason. About 7/8, roughly 87% of an iceberg's mass is hidden below the waterline.
So the part the lookout saw.
Eyewitnesses estimated the visible part was maybe 50 to 100 feet high and 200 to 400 feet long, which sounds big.
But it means the underwater mass was colossal, a huge, unseen underwater ram.
Precisely. Now, for decades, the common belief, the story everyone told, was that this underwater part tore a massive, continuous 300-foot gash down the side of the Titanic.
Like opening a can?
Sort of, yeah. That was the prevailing image.
But the science, and even some early analysis,
Yeah.
suggested something different.
Yes. Even back in the 1912 British inquiry, one of the key witnesses was Edward Wilding. He was a naval architect for Harland and Wolff, the builders.
Okay.
And Wilding argued, based purely on engineering principles and the time it took the ship to sink, that the damage couldn't have been a giant gash.
Why not?
His reasoning was simple. A 300-foot hole would have let water in so fast the ship would have plunged in minutes, maybe half an hour, not the 2 hours and 40 minutes it actually took.
So the slower sinking suggested smaller damage.
Smaller and likely distributed damage. The fact that water seemed to be entering multiple compartments unevenly suggested a series of separate, smaller breaches, not one continuous rip.
And this was just a hypothesis back then.
It was a deduction based on sound engineering, but yes, a hypothesis.
Mhm.
And it wasn't confirmed for, well, 84 years.
Until they found the wreck and could actually look.
Exactly. In 1996, expeditions used advanced sonar, specifically a sub-bottom profiler. It's like medical ultrasound. It sends sound waves that can penetrate the thick layers of mud that had buried the bow section.
And what did they find?
They found Wilding was absolutely right. The damage wasn't a gash at all. It was a series of 6 distinct, relatively small areas of buckling and separation along the hull plate seams.
6 small areas. How small are we talking?
The total area where water was coming in, only about 12 square feet.
12 square feet. That's like the size of a doorway. Or less.
Even less, more like the size of an average adult human body spread out. Some of the openings, the slits along the seams where rivets popped, were less than an inch wide.
That is absolutely staggering. That 12 square feet sank that ship.
It did. The damage points were labeled A through F minor damage right at the bow. Yeah. Then a couple of slits letting water into cargo hold number 1, DC. Some damage between holds 1 and 2D. Then a larger area of damage, crucially about 20 feet below the waterline between holds 2 and 3E. And finally, some contact further aft near boiler room number 6.
Okay, so point E being deep underwater would have let water in faster due to pressure.
Precisely. But the bigger question this raises is, why did the seams fail? Why didn't the steel plates themselves rip or puncture more dramatically?
This brings us to the rivets.
The rivets. There were about 3 million of them holding the Titanic's hull plates together. The plates themselves were high-quality steel for the time, but the rivets, they were made of wrought iron.
Wrought iron isn't steel.
No, it's different. Wrought iron is iron that has slag impurities, essentially silicate glass mixed into it, usually about 1 or 2%. When worked properly, the slag forms tiny fibers throughout the iron, which actually adds to its toughness and resistance to fatigue.
Okay, sounds good so far.
But here's the catch. Forensic metallurgists, like Dr. Tim Falk, examined rivets recovered from the wreck site. And they found something troubling.
What was that?
Specifically in the rivets used in the bow and stern sections of the ship areas where riveting had to be done by hand, not by the big hydraulic riveting machines used amidships, the quality was inconsistent, and in some cases, really substandard.
How substandard?
Instead of having 1–2% slag evenly distributed as fine fibers, some of these rivets had slag concentrations as high as 6 to 10%. And crucially, the slag was present in large, clumpy inclusions.
Making the rivets brittle.
Exactly, like having small chunks of glass embedded in the iron. It made the wrought iron much more prone to fracture under sudden stress, especially a shearing or glancing blow like the iceberg delivered.
So not tough, but brittle. Why the poor quality?
The leading hypothesis relates back to the sheer scale of production. Harland and Wolff were building Olympic and Titanic almost simultaneously. The demand for rivets was enormous.
They rushed it.
It seems likely. To make truly high-quality wrought iron, you need to work it extensively, repeatedly heating and hammering it, to distribute that slag evenly into fine fibers. The pressure to produce millions of rivets quickly might have led them to use less refined iron or skip some of the crucial working steps, especially for the hand-driven rivets.
Like incompletely mixed gravy, as one source put it.
That's a good analogy. So when the iceberg sideswiped the hull, instead of the steel plates tearing dramatically, the shock was enough to shear the heads off these brittle rivets along the seams. Pop, pop. The seams opened up.
A zipper effect.
A zipper effect, exactly. Caused by a hidden material defect combined with that bulkhead design flaw we talked about. It wasn't one big wound, but a series of smaller leaks that collectively overwhelmed the ship's ability to pump out the water or contain the flooding.
And the rate of flooding must have been intense, even through relatively small openings.
Terrifyingly fast. Computer models estimate water poured in at nearly 7 tons per second right after impact.
7 tons a second.
And remember that point E, the damage 20 feet below the waterline. That's where water pressure really becomes a factor.
Explain the pressure effect.
Water pressure increases significantly the deeper you go. For every 33 feet of depth, the pressure increases by about 1 atmosphere, or 14.7 pounds per square inch.
So the water coming in through those lower holes was forced in much harder.
Much, much faster, like water coming out of a high-pressure fire hose compared to a garden hose. This meant cargo hold 3, which suffered that deeper damage, flooded incredibly quickly, pulling the bow down even faster.
And as the bow sank lower.
The angle increased, more compartments flooded over the tops of those bulkheads. By about 12:40 a.m., roughly an hour after impact, estimates suggest 25,000 tons of water were already inside. By 2 a.m., it was around 39,000 tons. The bow was deep underwater. The stern was lifting high out of the sea.
Leading to the final breakup.
Right. The stresses on the hull became too immense, focused around the midsection, and the ship literally tore apart. And just to complete the pressure picture, where the wreck lies now, 2.5 miles down, the pressure is immense, almost 6,000 pounds per square inch.
Nearly 3 tons pressing on every single square inch. Unbelievable.
It gives you a sense of the forces involved, both during the sinking and acting on the wreck today.
This combination of flawed design, flawed materials, and overwhelming physics leads us right into the human factors. Part 3, the communication chaos and the evacuation problems.
Yeah, the human element is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable.
We mentioned Captain Smith maintaining speed, which was standard practice. But what about the warnings? They weren't completely blind, were they?
Far from it. Over the course of the voyage, the Titanic received at least 7 distinct ice warnings from other ships in the area. Ships like the Caronia, the Baltic, the America, the Masaba, they all reported ice nearby.
7 warnings. So what happened?
Well, Smith did react slightly. They altered course a bit further south than originally planned. But crucially, he didn't slow the ship down from its 22.5 knots.
Why not, if there's ice reported ahead?
It seems counterintuitive to us now, but the prevailing wisdom among captains then was that the ocean was big enough, lookouts were sharp enough, and ships were maneuverable enough to spot and avoid ice, even at speed. There was also likely some pressure, maybe unspoken, from White Star Line director Bruce Ismay, who was on board, to make a good time on the maiden voyage, perhaps beat the Olympics time.
So a combination of standard practice and maybe some commercial pressure. But were all the warnings actually seen by the captain or the bridge officers?
And that's the critical failure. No. The Senate report specifically highlights a crucial warning from the steamer Masaba. It was received hours before the collision and detailed the exact area they were heading into. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs.
That sounds pretty specific.
Extremely specific. But that message, received by the wireless operators, was apparently never formally passed along to Captain Smith or the officers on the bridge. It got logged, but not delivered where it mattered most.
Why? How does that happen?
It points to a systemic problem with how wireless radio was integrated into ship operations back then.
It was new technology, relatively speaking.
Very new, and Titanic had the best. The most powerful transmitter on any merchant ship, a 5-kilowatt Marconi system with a range of hundreds of miles. And crucially, it had 2 Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, providing 24-hour coverage. That was rare.
So they had the tech and the manpower. What was the problem?
The problem was who they worked for. Phillips and Bride weren't officers of the Titanic. They were employees of the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. Their primary job, their main source of income and the company's revenue, was sending and receiving paid personal messages for the wealthy first-class passengers.
So passenger telegram took priority over ship safety warnings.
It appears so, especially when the operators were busy. They were handling a huge backlog of messages heading to the powerful shore station at Cape Race in Newfoundland. Navigation warnings were secondary traffic.
And this led to the most infamous communication breakdown of all, the California.
Yes. The SS Californian was another ship, relatively close by, less than 20 miles away, it turned out. At about 10:55 p.m., maybe 45 minutes before Titanic hit the ice, the Californian had stopped for the night because it was completely surrounded by dense field ice.
Sensible decision.
Very sensible. Its wireless operator tried to contact Titanic directly to warn them. Using Morse code, he sent, "Say, old man, we're stopped and surrounded by ice."
A direct, urgent warning from a nearby ship.
Exactly. But Jack Phillips on the Titanic was trying to clear that backlog of passenger messages with Cape Race. The Californian's signal, being so close, came in incredibly loudly, blasting in his ears and interfering with the weaker signal from Cape Race.
So Phillips was annoyed.
Furious,
Yeah.
apparently. He cut the Californian operator off mid-transmission with the now infamous reply, "Shut up! Shut up! I am busy. I am working Cape Race."
Wow.
The operator on the Californian, understandably rebuffed, and probably near the end of his shift anyway, he was their only operator, just switched off his radio equipment and went to bed around 11:30 p.m.
Meaning he missed the distress calls later.
He missed everything. The CQD and the newer SOS signals that Titanic started sending out less than an hour later.
The Senate inquiry must have come down hard on the California.
It did. Senator Smith's committee concluded the Californian's captain and officers showed inexcusable indifference and negligence. They saw Titanic's lights. They saw the distress rockets being fired.
They saw the rockets.
Yes, officers on the Californian saw 8 white rockets fired from the direction of the stopped steamer, but they rationalized them away. They thought maybe they were just company signals, private signals between ships, not distress signals. White Star Line's company signals used green stars, apparently, but they didn't investigate. They never woke their radio operator.
Even though they knew they were surrounded by ice and saw a ship firing rockets nearby.
Incredible, isn't it? They estimated the ship was about 19 miles away, later confirmed to be roughly accurate. Had they acted, they were close enough to have potentially saved many, if not all, of the people in the water.
That single exchange, "Shut up, I am busy," and the subsequent inaction, it cost lives, hundreds of lives.
It really highlights the systemic failures. Lack of standardized protocols, the prioritization of commercial traffic, no mandatory 24-hour radio watch on all ships. These were key factors.
So the warnings failed. The collision happened. Now the evacuation. Another area plagued by problems, starting with the lifeboats themselves.
Right. The lifeboat situation is another layer of tragedy. The regulations at the time, governed by the British Board of Trade, were horribly outdated.
How so?
They based the required number of lifeboat seats purely on the ship's gross tonnage, using a scale that hadn't been updated for the new generation of massive liners like Titanic. Based on that outdated rule, Titanic only needed a lifeboat space for 960 people.
But it had more than that, didn't it?
It did. White Star Line actually exceeded the legal minimum. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats in total, 16 standard wooden boats on davits, and 4 smaller collapsible boats with canvas sides. Together, these had a maximum capacity of 1,178 people.
Okay, better than the minimum, but how many people were actually on board?
On our maiden voyage, there were 2,224 people, passengers and crew combined.
So lifeboat space for 11,178. People on board, 2,224. That's only enough seats for about 53%. Just over half.
Exactly. Even if every single lifeboat had been filled completely to capacity, nearly half the people on board were doomed from the start. There simply wasn't room for them.
And it gets worse, doesn't it? They weren't even filled properly.
That's the second tragedy within the lifeboat situation. Many of the early boats launched were nowhere near full.
Why would they do that?
Several reasons contributed to the chaos and underloading. Firstly, there was a lack of confidence among some crew members and perhaps passengers that the davits, the cranes lowering the boats, could actually hold the weight of a fully loaded boat. They were newly designed.
So they lowered them partially fuel out of fear they might buckle?
That seems to have been a factor, yes.
Yeah.
Secondly, in the early stages, many passengers were reluctant to leave the huge, brightly lit, seemingly stable deck of the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, for a small, dark boat being lowered into the freezing Atlantic. It didn't seem real yet.
Denial, maybe?
Denial, confusion, lack of urgency, and critically, a lack of proper organization and drills. The crew hadn't practiced a full-scale evacuation. Many didn't know their assigned boat stations or how to manage the loading efficiently.
Give me an example of underloading.
Lifeboat number 7, the first one away, had a capacity of 65 people. It was lowered with only about 25 or 28 people in it. Many others left significantly underfilled. If they had been loaded properly, it's estimated another 500 people could have been saved just with the boats they had.
The survival rates tell a stark story about who got into those boats.
They really do. The Senate report data is devastating. For first-class passengers, the survival rate was around 62%.
Okay, what about the others?
Second class, about 42% survived, but third class, only 25%. And the crew fared even worse, only 24% survival.
Why the huge difference, especially for third class?
It was a combination of factors. Their accommodation was lower down and further from the boat deck. Communication was poor. Many didn't understand the orders or the severity of the situation initially. And yes, those locked gates, meant for immigration control, undoubtedly hampered their escape in the confusion. There was clear class distinction in the outcomes.
And the famous order, women and children first. How is that applied?
Inconsistently, which again points to a lack of clear, drilled protocol. It depended heavily on the officer in charge of loading on each side of the ship.
Oh,
On the starboard right side, First Officer William Murdoch interpreted the order more leniently. If there were no more women or children waiting nearby, he allowed men into the boats to fill them up.
okay, pragmatic.
But on the port left side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted the order very strictly, women and children only. He prevented men from boarding, even if it meant boats were launched with empty seats. There are accounts of him threatening men with a pistol, although other officers also drew weapons mainly to prevent panic or rushes on the boats.
So your chance of survival as a man literally depended on which side of the ship you happen to be on.
In many cases, yes. It was chaotic.
And for those who ended up in the water, the end came quickly.
Brutally quickly. The main killer wasn't drowning, although that happened too. It was hypothermia.
The water temperature was incredibly cold.
Freezing, literally. The sea temperature was measured at 27 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below the freezing point of fresh water because it was salty. The air temperature wasn't much better, around 33 degrees F.
How long can someone survive in water that cold?
Not long at all. Medical estimates suggest consciousness is lost within 15 minutes and death likely within 15 to 30 minutes in 32-degree water. At 27 degrees, even faster, maybe less than 15 minutes for many.
And did the lifeboats go back for them?
Very few did, and mostly not immediately. There was fear of being swamped by hundreds of desperate people trying to climb in, fear of suction as the massive ship went under. Only one boat, lifeboat number 14 under Officer Lowe, went back after reorganizing, but by then, most sounds had ceased. They pulled only 4 people alive from the water, one of whom died shortly after.
So over 1,500 people died, mostly from the cold. A failure to prevent the sinking, compounded by failures in communication and evacuation.
It's a cascade of failures, really.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the aftermath, the legacy, and how science continues to study it. Part 4.
Right, and a big part of understanding the legacy, especially before the wreck was found, relied on the people who survived. Eyewitness testimony. How reliable is that?
Well, that's a fascinating area of psychology and memory science. Under extreme stress, like surviving a shipwreck, memory does strange things.
How so?
Stress can actually increase the accuracy of memory for the central details, the things you were directly focused on for survival. But it also causes tunnel vision. You lose the peripheral details, the bigger picture. And sometimes the brain subconsciously fills in gaps or even manufactures details to create a coherent narrative later on.
So survivors might remember things very vividly, but not always accurately.
Exactly. Or they might remember different things depending on their experience. Take the ship's final angle as it sank.
We mentioned the conflicting accounts.
Wildly conflicting. Some survivors swore it went down at a steep 45-degree angle. Others said 60 degrees. Some even claimed it stood vertically 90 degrees before plunging.
What does modern science say the angle was?
Computer modeling, combined with analysis of the wreck, suggests the angle was actually much shallower when the hull fractured, probably only around 11 or 12 degrees.
There's a huge difference from 90 degrees.
It is. People's perception was massively influenced by where they were, their line of sight, the sheer scale. How do you even estimate the angle of something nearly 900 feet long in the dark? And the trauma of the event. Second Officer Lightoller's account of being able to swim from the bridge level almost horizontally towards the crow's nest supports that shallower angle before the break.
So eyewitness accounts are valuable, but need scientific corroboration.
Absolutely. They provide the human story, but for the physical mechanics, you need the evidence from the wreck itself.
Which wasn't available until 1985. And even then, studying it 2.5 miles down presents huge challenges. You can't just swim down with a camera.
No, the pressure is too immense and visibility is terrible. Even with powerful lights on submersibles, you can only see a few feet in front of you. Taking a single photograph of the whole wreck is impossible.
So how do we get those incredible overall images of the bow section, for instance?
That's where photomosaics come in. Pioneering work was done by people like Paul Mathias from Polaris Imaging.
How does that work?
Basically, a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, systematically moves across the wreck site, taking thousands of high-resolution digital images, each one slightly overlapping the last.
Like stitching together a panorama.
Exactly, but on a massive three-dimensional scale. In one project in 1998, they took over 3,000 electronic images. Then comes the painstaking part. Using sophisticated software to digitally stitch all those individual images together, correcting for distortion in perspective to create one large, seamless composite image.
How long did that take?
For that 1998 mosaic, it took almost a year of computer processing time.
Wow. But the result gives you the big picture.
It does. The photomosaics were crucial. They clearly showed the bow section relatively intact, confirming the glancing blow nature of the damage. But they also showed the stern section completely mangled, indicating massive implosions from water pressure as it sank and explosions from trapped air bursting out when it hit the seabed. It confirmed the ship broke apart violently.
And now, that wreck is slowly disappearing. Corrosion.
Yes, the deep ocean is a surprisingly aggressive environment for steel. You have high salinity, immense pressure, slightly acidic sediments.
But also factors that preserve, right? Lack of light, low oxygen.
True, those slow down some types of decay. But the dominant process on the Titanic wreck is electrochemical corrosion, driven by microbial life. Specifically, those formations everyone sees, rusticles.
They look like rusty icicles hanging off the hull.
That's a good description. Reddish-brown, poor structures. They cover maybe 80% of the hull now. And they're not just simple rust.
What are they then?
Dr. Roy Cullimore, a microbiologist, did extensive research on them. He found rusticles are actually complex ecosystems, like living structures. They're built and inhabited by a consortium of different microbes.
Microbes eating the ship.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
There are iron-oxidizing bacteria that help form the physical structure. Then, deep inside the rusticle, in low oxygen conditions, you have sulfate-reducing bacteria that are actually consuming metallic iron as part of their metabolism, producing iron sulfides. There are also fungi involved.
So it's a biological process breaking down the steel.
A biogeochemical process, yes. These microbes are basically accelerating the return of the refined iron in the ship's steel back to its more stable, natural state iron oxides and minerals. Like rust, but on overdrive and biologically mediated.
How fast is this happening?
It's hard to say precisely, but estimates based on the amount of iron tied up in the rusticles are alarming. Back in 1996, scientists calculated the rusticles already contained about 175 tons of iron that used to be part of the hull. The total weight of the rusticles then was estimated at 650 tons.
That's a lot of missing ship. How long does the wreck have left?
Predictions vary wildly. Some say significant collapse could happen within decades, maybe 15, 20 years from now. Others give it longer, maybe a century or more. But the consensus is clear. The Titanic, as we see it in photos, is actively disintegrating. Eventually, it will be little more than a rust stain and a debris field on the ocean floor.
Which makes the recovery and conservation of artifacts even more important before they're lost too. But bringing things up from that environment must be incredibly tricky.
Extremely tricky. The moment objects are removed from the deep sea environment, the high pressure, the cold, the specific water chemistry, they start to deteriorate rapidly when exposed to surface conditions, especially oxygen.
What happens?
Iron objects are particularly problematic. They can literally start to fizzle, steam, or even crack apart as trapped gases expand and rapid oxidation, rusting begins. Ceramics and glass might look stable, but they're filled with embedded salts from the seawater. As they dry out, those salts crystallize and expand, causing microscopic fractures that can shatter the object.
So conservation has to start immediately.
Immediately. The first step is stabilization, usually keeping the object submerged in water. Then begins a long process of cleaning and, crucially, desalination, removing those destructive salts.
How do they get the salts out?
Often through long baths in highly purified, deionized water, the salts slowly leach out into the fresh water, which has to be changed repeatedly. For metal objects, they often use a process called electrolysis.
Like jump-starting a car battery.
Sort of, but controlled. The metal artifact is placed in a chemical bath and connected to an electrical current. Depending on how it's set up, the current can help draw out the negative chloride ions from salt, or stabilize the metal ions, essentially reversing or halting the corrosion process at a molecular level. It takes a long time.
What about organic materials? Paper, leather, wood? It's amazing anything like that survived.
It is surprising, but the cold, dark, low oxygen conditions help preserve them better than expected. but they're waterlogged and fragile.
How do you conserve those?
Often involves freeze drying to remove the water without causing the material to shrink or collapse, then treatment to prevent mold, and often impregnation with something like polyethylene glycol or PEG.
What's PEG?
It's a water-soluble wax. As the water slowly evaporates or is removed, the PEG fills the microscopic spaces within the material structure, providing internal support and preventing it from crumbling.
There's a lot of science just in saving the artifacts.
A huge amount. And there's also a conservation philosophy involved. The conservators working on Titanic artifacts generally chose minimal restoration.
Meaning they leave the damage.
They stabilize the object to prevent further decay, but they often leave the signs of its time underwater. For example, you might see hollow-handled knives or silver teapots that were crushed flat by the immense pressure. They preserve that damage because it tells part of the object's unique story, its 2.5-mile journey to the seabed.
So bringing it all together, this deep dive really shows the Titanic sinking wasn't just one thing, was it?
Not at all. It wasn't a single unavoidable event. It was this perfect storm, a confluence of factors. You had the technical assumptions, maybe overconfidence in the design, the brittle rivets, the low bulkheads.
Then the natural world playing its part.
Right, that unusually heavy ice year, the specific iceberg being in that specific place at that specific time.
And layered on top of all that, the human and systemic failures.
Absolutely. The communication protocols, prioritizing commercial messages, the lack of radio standards, the failure of the Californian to respond, the outdated lifeboat regulations, the chaotic evacuation, the inconsistent leadership. It's a long list.
But the aftermath, the inquiries, particularly the U.S. Senate one led by Senator Smith, they did lead to change, right?
Profound change. The Titanic disaster, as horrific as it was, directly led to major improvements in maritime safety that benefit us even today.
What were the key recommendations?
Things that seem obvious now but weren't standard then. Mandating auxiliary power for radios so they'd work even if the ship's main engines failed. Requiring 24-hour radio watches on passenger ships, mandating enough lifeboats for every single person on board, standardizing lifeboat drills, licensing radio operators as ship's officers, accountable to the captain, not just a private company. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, in 1914 was a direct result.
So the tragedy forced a fundamental rethink of safety at sea.
It really did. The core lesson, perhaps, is about the danger of complacency, of believing too much in our technology or our standard procedures. Captain Smith wasn't necessarily reckless by 1912 standards. He was following common practice, trusting a ship everyone believed was practically unsinkable.
It took the disaster and the science that followed to reveal the hidden flaws in both the ship and the system.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider. If we look around at our own world today, our own advanced technologies and complex systems, what are we taking for granted? What current convenience, what standard operating procedure maybe in data security or AI development or transportation or infrastructure do we collectively consider unsinkable or foolproof? What assumption are we making, steaming ahead at full speed, that future analysis, perhaps prompted by some unforeseen event, might reveal as a critical, hidden, and potentially catastrophic flaw?
It's a sobering question. What's our modern-day equivalent of sailing too fast into an ice field we haven't properly acknowledged?
Something to think about. That's it for this deep dive.